They told me to stay quiet, just take notes and observe. But silence doesn't sit well when the supplier looks lost. The tension crackles, and I happen to speak fluent French. There's a particular kind of quiet in corporate boardrooms, the kind that isn't peaceful, but loaded. A quiet that carries the hum of buzzing fluorescent lights, the low clink of a water glass being returned to its coaster, the shuffling of expensive fabric as people sit too straight in tailored suits. That morning, the air inside the 27th floor conference room was thick with it. The supplier, Monsieur Lefebvre, sat at the far end of the sleek obsidian table. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. His tie was perfect, his folder pristine, but his gaze drifted across the room like he was scanning for an exit. I'd seen that look before, too many times. It was the face of someone who had walked into a trap labeled collaboration. To my left, Julia from Strategic Procurement had taken control, as usual. Her smile was surgical, her language clipped and overconfident. "We're offering you exclusivity in exchange for tiered pricing," she said, sliding the new draft across the table as if it were a gift. "I think you'll find the terms, agreeable." He blinked, then looked down at the document like it had personally insulted his ancestors. Microhook. I glanced between them. I knew that look too, the one where someone pretends to be reviewing numbers, but is actually debating whether to walk out or flip the table. The silence stretched, then broke, with a sharp question in French. "Et si nous refusons les volumes trimestriels? What if we reject the quarterly volume targets?" Julia blinked, didn't move, didn't answer, just looked at him like he'd spoken in Morse code. "Well?" she asked. But it wasn't a question. It was a prompt for someone, me, to translate, except she didn't say it to me. She said it into the room like someone would magically appear and solve it. That was supposed to be my cue. I wasn't on the org chart for this deal, just support staff. No badge of rank, no contractual power, but I knew the product. I knew the supplier, and I knew what he had just said wasn't a small thing. Still, protocol was clear. I wasn't to speak unless prompted. But silence in negotiation is a statement, and so is confusion. A man asking a direct question and getting a blank stare isn't just awkward, it's offensive. "Do you mind if I translate?" I asked gently, looking at Julia. Her eyes hardened. "You're not part of this negotiation," she said. The words fell like ice cubes into hot tea, jarring, unnecessary, and messy. I nodded, and translated anyway. Lefebvre looked at me. "Merci." He nodded once, and that's when something shifted. Not in him, in the air, like the moment before a wave crashes and everything holds its breath. He closed the folder, looked at Julia, then at the rest of the room, carefully avoiding me. "In that case," he said, in English this time, his accent sharp as a blade, "we're walking away from this deal." The silence that followed was not the same as before. This one was pure chaos in disguise. Julia's pen stopped mid-note. The director of finance leaned forward like maybe he'd misheard. Someone coughed, and it sounded like a gunshot. Lefebvre stood, calm, elegant, but absolute. He shook no hands. He simply walked out. Then came the scramble. "Why didn't anyone clarify the volume clause?" "Wasn't that your job?" "No, I thought you had it." "Why didn't he say something sooner?" "He did." And I sat there quietly, watching their carefully stacked tower of assumptions collapse like wet paper. They had no idea that walking out was just the first consequence. The real storm hadn't even started. They tried to act like it wasn't a disaster. "We'll circle back," Julia said, tapping her nails against the marble tabletop as if sound could replace strategy. "This happens. Suppliers bluff." Except Lefebvre didn't bluff. Ever. He was old-school French manufacturing, elegant contracts, brutal consistency. If he stood up, it wasn't a dance move. It was over. The following hour felt like a fire drill without flames. Half the room was on their phones, muttering in different corners. The other half typed aggressively in Slack threads and pinged people with red emojis like that would fix anything. I sat still. My laptop opened to the same Excel sheet I'd brought in, tracking pricing scenarios we'd never get to use. Nobody asked me anything, even though the sheet I had clearly showed what was wrong. We'd asked for quarterly growth without forecasting accuracy, wrapped it in exclusivity, and forgot to translate the goodwill. But I was just the translator. Support. Background noise. Except in that moment, I was also the only one who had understood the warning signs and been told to shut up. By noon, the Slack war had escalated to a full email thread. Urgent. Impact of supplier exit. Julia's name at the top. Legal looped in. Procurement looped in. Notably, I was not looped in, but people forget things in panic, especially who was in the room when it went south. At 12:42, someone forwarded it to me by accident. Can you cross-check this with the supplier contract draft? Read the email from legal. We need to know if we've triggered any early termination clauses. That's when I opened the original document and found something chilling. The version Lefebvre received had a clause in it that didn't match the draft we'd previously aligned with him on. A silent update. Someone had edited the volume requirements upward without notifying the supplier. It wasn't just a bad ask, it was a bait and switch, and I knew exactly when it happened. The Friday before the meeting, Julia had asked me to reformat the presentation. Just layout fixes, she said. But she'd sent me a PDF, and the underlying contract file had already been modified. The new clause wasn't bold. It wasn't even discussed. It was buried on page 12 under performance expectations, phrased like standard boilerplate. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. This wasn't just poor negotiation, it was borderline unethical. And in our industry, trust was currency. Breaking it this way could blacklist us with more than just Lefebvre. I stepped out to get coffee, not because I needed it, but because I needed air. As I stood by the hallway window, I heard voices from the small glass-walled room behind me. He just got up and left? That was the VP of Finance. He didn't even give us a chance to counteroffer, Julia snapped, because someone decided to play interpreter. Silence. Then, from someone else. Who told her to speak anyway? And that was it. The pivot. The moment they decided to blame me, not for mistranslating, but for stepping out of line. I knew how this worked. They wouldn't confront me directly. They'd let it simmer, let it build, and then when things got tight, I'd be the easy name to cut from the chain. Not because I was wrong, but because I was right too soon. So I opened my inbox, scrolled down, drafted a reply to that accidental forward. Subject, urgent, impact of supplier exit. Hi, attaching my notes from the negotiation, including a breakdown of the contractual discrepancy I observed. Best. 5 minutes later, I was added to the thread. What I didn't know then was that the contract change wasn't an accident, and I had just stepped on a live wire. Have you ever been blamed for doing the right thing too soon? Share your story. I'm reading them all. I thought my email would vanish into the thread like a pebble into a river. Quiet splash, forgotten ripple. Instead, it detonated. At 1:08 p.m., my calendar pinged with an invite I hadn't expected. Contractual review, urgent. Please attend. No details, just 5 names, legal, procurement, Julia, one person from compliance, and me. They needed me now. Or rather, they needed what I had seen. The room was smaller than the main conference one, but colder. Everything about it felt sterile. The whiteboard, the stale coffee smell, the polite nods that tried to hide tension thicker than any non-disclosure clause. Julia didn't look at me when I walked in, just kept her eyes on the legal director, a silver-haired man named Collins who always wore 3 pens in his front pocket. 1 for writing, 2 for intimidation. He tapped the paper I'd flagged. You're sure this wasn't in the version the supplier originally saw? Yes, I said. This clause, section 4.2.3, wasn't there in Q4. I reviewed that version line by line with their translator before we sent it. And you're saying it was changed after that? I nodded, silently, without discussion. I wasn't informed, and it wasn't brought up in negotiation. Collins tilted his head like a falcon about to dive. Do you have access logs? Metadata? I did. I'd kept a local copy of the shared draft. Not out of paranoia, just habit. The kind you build when people forget your name but remember your work. I pulled it up. Time-stamped, clearly showing the clause wasn't there on December 12th. The updated one? December 15th, uploaded by J. Stratton Knots Corp. Julia shifted in her chair. She crossed her arms. That's standard. We update expectations all the time before finalization. Collins didn't blink. But not without supplier notification, and definitely not without redlining. Silence. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't just awkward. It was risky, legally risky, and I wasn't the only one realizing it. The compliance rep, a quiet woman named Rima, who rarely spoke unless necessary, finally leaned in. If this goes to arbitration, she said, that clause won't hold. Worse, it may paint us as acting in bad faith. That puts future supplier trust in jeopardy. Julia tried to push back. But we never signed the final contract. We were still in discussions. Yes, Rima said coolly. And we just gave them a reason to blacklist us across their network. My stomach twisted, but not from fear, from recognition. The house of cards was real, and I had just pulled the wrong one. When the meeting ended, nobody looked at me as I left. Not with thanks, not with blame. Just absence, the kind reserved for people who suddenly matter in ways no one planned for. By 3:15 p.m., HR pinged me. Hi, can we chat for a few minutes? Nothing chills like a casual message in moments like this. I clicked the Zoom link with hands that didn't quite shake. Yet. On the other side of the call was Jenna, the HR business partner for our department. Young, polished, smiling like someone selling you something soft, right before something sharp. Hey, thanks for hopping on, she said. Just a quick pulse check after today's meeting. I waited. That's the trick with HR. Never fill the silence. Let them speak first. So, she continued, I heard you spoke up during negotiations earlier, and then in the review meeting. Yes, I said. I was asked to clarify contract inconsistencies. Right. It's just, sometimes context gets lost. And when multiple teams are involved, lines of responsibility can get a little blurry. You understand, right? The sweetness was so polished, it was cutting. You're suggesting I crossed a line? I asked. She smiled wider. No one's saying that. We just want to ensure everyone stays in their lane so we can move forward with alignment. Translation? Don't do that again. What they didn't realize was that the contract wasn't the only thing with a paper trail. The next morning, my badge didn't beep right. It clicked green, but with a delay. The kind of hesitation that makes you wonder if someone, somewhere, had considered revoking it. I stood in front of the elevator a second longer than usual, watching the floors crawl down, trying not to read into it. When I got to my desk, my chair was missing. Not stolen, just reassigned. Someone from facilities had sent a note about redistribution due to office reconfig. It was technically nothing. But in an open office, losing your chair is like being uninvited to your own desk. I retrieved a spare from the print room and wheeled it back like a refugee. At least my laptop still logged me in. That was the day they started excluding me from meetings I had originally been on the invite for. The recurring Supplier Strategy Weekly canceled on my calendar. The Q1 procurement Outlook deck I had helped build, locked for editing. My read-only access wasn't an accident. It was a message. Julia passed my desk around noon, her heels clicking in a rhythm that sounded too satisfied. She didn't stop, just said over her shoulder, "Thanks again for your input yesterday." I said nothing. Some things rot faster in silence, but silence doesn't protect you, not in corporate. By 2 p.m., the rumor had a pulse. She undermined Julia in front of the supplier. No, I heard she went rogue with confidential documents. Wasn't she just supposed to be there for note-taking? They didn't use my name, just she. That's how erasure starts, by generalizing the person until no one has to feel guilty about what's being done to them. I kept working. Opened the shared contract repository, searched for activity logs, not just for the Lefebvre file, but all contract edits tagged to Julia's ID in the last 90 days. That's when I found it. 2 other deals, 2 other files, both updated after verbal agreements, both with minor yet significant changes made post-discussion and pre-signature. No red lines, no comms, just buried shifts. This wasn't a one-time error. This was a pattern, and patterns leave trails. I took screenshots, full-screen captures with timestamps, version histories, edit metadata, stored them on an encrypted external. Not to use, not to threaten, just to not disappear. Because I'd seen how this story plays out, not in movies, but in Monday morning layoffs, in performance realignments, in the HR emails that start with "hope you're well" and end with "per policy, your system access will be revoked within 24 hours. By 4 p.m., I was called into a meeting with the director of procurement, Mr. Sanders, gray suit, always smiling like someone trying to sell you a timeshare and a moral compromise at the same time. "Come in, sit," he said. "I'll make this quick." I sat. There's been a lot of talk about the Lefebvre situation. Obviously, it didn't go the way we expected. I stayed silent. He leaned back. "What concerns me is this idea that there was a deliberate misrepresentation of the contract. That's a serious accusation." "I didn't accuse anyone," I said calmly. "I just pointed out a factual discrepancy." "Still," he said, tilting his head, "we're a team, and raising things in certain ways, especially when tensions are high, can be destabilizing for culture." There it was. Culture. The shield word. The word they use to warn you without warning you. "You're asking me to ignore a mistake that cost us a major supplier," I said. "I'm asking you," he said with a smile, "to trust leadership to handle it." I smiled back. "I did. That's why I sent the email." He didn't smile after that. They thought the worst had passed. But what they didn't know, someone else had seen everything. Friday mornings were usually slower, less traffic, softer clothes. The air around the office felt gentler, like the building itself was easing into the weekend. But not today. Today, the silence had teeth. I could feel it the second I walked in. How conversations paused when I passed. How shoulders tilted ever so slightly to block screens. Even the receptionist gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't fear, it was positioning. People weren't avoiding me because they didn't believe me. They were avoiding me because they suspected I was right. And no one wants to stand too close to the one carrying the truth when things implode. At 9:42 a.m., I received an email from an external sender. No subject line, just an attached zip file and 2 words in the body. "You're not alone." I didn't open it. That's rule number 1 in corporate. When things get political, treat unexpected kindness like an IED. Instead, I replied with a blank message and BCC'd legal quietly with the file untouched. Then I stood. I needed to breathe, to move, to remember I was still a person and not just a cautionary tale in someone's Slack message. I headed to the micro kitchen. 2 people were already there, mid-conversation, whispering low. She found 3 contracts. "No way." She screenshotted everything. "Legal's got it now." I poured myself coffee and didn't say a word, but I felt their eyes on my back. That's when it hit me. The rumor had mutated. I wasn't just the translator anymore. I was becoming something else. A symbol, a problem, a potential whistleblower, which made me dangerous. By noon, I was called into another Zoom. This time, it wasn't HR. It was legal, with someone I hadn't seen before, a senior counsel from the parent company. "Thank you for joining," she said crisply. "This isn't disciplinary. We just want clarity." She didn't smile. They asked about timelines, about access, about knowledge, and for every question, I gave only what they asked. No more, no less. Not out of secrecy, but out of precision, because words matter in law and in war. After 25 minutes, she leaned back and folded her hands. "Do you believe anyone intentionally modified those documents to mislead?" I paused. "Let me ask you something," I said softly. "If I believed that, would it change how you handle this?" She didn't answer, but the pause was long. That's when I knew. They weren't just gathering facts. They were bracing for fallout. And then the door opened. Not metaphorically, literally. Julia stepped into the same glass-walled room where I was sitting. She didn't look at me. She looked at the legal rep and said, "I was told we'd be discussing documentation practices." Her voice was flat, controlled, but something in her eyes flickered. Not anger, not fear, recognition. She knew the walls were closing in. By 3 p.m., half the procurement team was gone for off-site planning, except the only thing being planned now was survival. I got another email, this one from my old mentor, now in compliance. "Just be careful. People are choosing sides, and not everyone's choosing truth. What they didn't expect was that the supplier had their own version of events, and they'd just been asked to send it." Monday didn't begin with coffee. It began with a forwarded email, subject line, "Re-clarification request regarding December 15th revision. Please see attached statement." Sender, legal team at Lefebvre Industrial Group. Recipient, our compliance department. CC'd, internal affairs. BCC'd, unknown, attached. A signed letter. PDF, letterhead, digital seal glowing like a brand. The kind you don't attach unless you're drawing a line. The kind that starts chain reactions. The supplier had spoken. I wasn't supposed to see it. But someone in compliance, someone I once trained, someone who still used my old Excel macros, quietly dropped it into my inbox. No comment, just the document. My heart raced as I read. The letter was clear, cold, professional, but beneath the diplomatic phrasing was unmistakable weight. Lefebvre had kept a version history of our communications, emails, Zoom recordings, a French-translated copy of the original draft they had agreed to, and proof that the final document had been altered without notice. In our view, it read, "This constitutes a breach of negotiation integrity. While we respect the professionalism of certain individuals involved, the discrepancies observed have forced us to reconsider all future partnerships." There it was. Not just a rejection, a blacklist, not just for Julia, not just for the deal, for the company, and I knew what would happen next. The real panic was about to begin. By noon, I noticed the first ripple. It pulled access logs on document histories. At 12:17, Julia was locked out due to security audit. Her name vanished from 3 shared folders. At 1:04, a calendar notification hit the whole department. All hands. 1:30 p.m. Mandatory attendance location, main auditorium. Speaker, COO, when the COO shows up in person, something's on fire. The auditorium was packed by 1:28. People had that look, the one between curiosity and fear. The COO, Harris, stood under harsh LED lights in a suit that was too crisp for how uncomfortable he looked. "Let's keep this brief," he started. "You've all heard some version of the rumors." He paused. No one breathed. "Yes, we've lost a supplier. Yes, there are questions about process and documentation. And yes, we're investigating. Fully. No names, no blame, just process." But everyone knew. And then he said the thing that shifted the mood from tight to frozen. "We've engaged an external review board to audit contract handling across all verticals for Q3 and Q4, effective immediately." Translation: every single deal Julia touched is now radioactive. Back at my desk, my inbox pulsed. Questions, pings, people remembering I was in the room, that I had translated, that I had stayed calm. One message stood out, from someone in external comms. "Hi, legal mentioned you might have clean context on what actually happened in the Lefebvre negotiation. Can we talk? Off record?" I stared at it. Because suddenly, being invisible wasn't the risk anymore. Being seen was. They thought the supplier had ended it, but someone else was just beginning to ask why it ever got that far. Tuesday morning came with a headline, not a tabloid, not some vague whisper on LinkedIn, an actual industry bulletin. Major manufacturing partner pulls out of U.S. contract over governance concerns. It didn't name our company, but it didn't have to. Anyone in supply chain, procurement, or B2B distribution knew exactly who it meant. The clues were too specific. The volume thresholds, the region, the French supplier. Within hours, it started circulating. First in Slack threads labeled FYI, then in group chats. Someone even printed it and pinned it to the break room corkboard, anonymously, of course. By 10:12 a.m., the CEO's office sent out an internal memo. "We do not comment on ongoing contractual matters. All employees are advised to refrain from external engagement on this topic." Silence, weaponized. But inside the office, the silence was already cracking. People were talking, not just in whispers, but in tones sharpened by fear and strategy. Those who had once backed Julia were suddenly busy. In client meetings. Working remotely. She was still technically employed, but her office was dark. Meanwhile, I was summoned. Again. This time by comms. Not legal, not HR, not procurement. The narrative shapers. The room had glass walls, but the blinds were drawn, which already told me everything. The director of corporate comms sat across from me, flanked by a communications strategist I didn't recognize, both with that practiced neutrality used for crisis containment. "We'd like to clarify some things before external media takes hold of the wrong version," the director began. I wasn't planning to talk to anyone, I said. Good, he replied. But we do need your internal account. Precise, clean, no speculation. I handed over a printed summary. Timeline, dates, timestamps. No opinion, just observation. They scanned it in silence. Then the strategist spoke. Do you still have a working relationship with anyone at Lefebvre? The question didn't surprise me, but my answer did. Yes, I said, because I did. Their operations manager, Adrian, we'd worked side by side for 3 years across 2 time zones, shared late-night translation calls, delivery crises, even bad coffee jokes. And unlike corporate execs, he remembered names. He remembered me. Would he confirm your version? They asked. I met their eyes. I didn't give a version. I gave the truth. There it was, the line I didn't plan to say, but said anyway. By the time I returned to my desk, a new email was waiting. Subject: Contractual Power and Role Review Sender, Internal Affairs. Attachment: Policy 9.3 Review Notice, Policy 9.3, the buried one, the one that defines authority thresholds for document control and interdepartmental negotiation. Most employees have never read it. I had. And I knew exactly what it meant. Someone was looking to rewrite the chain of command, not to fix it, but to protect themselves from it ever being questioned again. Julia's name wasn't in the attachment. Mine was. So was the phrase, incidental breach of protocol by non-decision maker staff. That's how they framed it. Not as integrity, as breach. What they didn't see coming? Someone else had already filed a request under Policy 9.4, and it wasn't about me. Policy 9.4 is rarely invoked. It's the kind of clause that sits buried in the internal wiki under 6 layers of compliance and documentation. A skeleton key for employees who suspect internal misconduct. A formal protection request, triggered when someone believes their actions, while outside protocol, were necessary to prevent harm. And someone had pulled it, not me. At 8:17 a.m., the legal inbox flagged an internal form submission. Request type 9.4 protective disclosure. Filed by anonymous subject of concern, procurement strategy changes. Q4Q1 description. Alleged unilateral clause changes without stakeholder sign-off. I was copied on the follow-up as a related witness. Suddenly, the spotlight shifted. I wasn't alone anymore. Now, I was part of a pattern. By 10 a.m., people who had ghosted me last week were now sending Slack messages in lowercase, the digital version of whispering. Did you see the 9.4? Who filed it? They mentioned Q4. Is this about Julia? Do you think they'll audit older contracts? There was something unsettling about the way fear moves through an open plan office. Like a virus without symptoms, it shows up in behavior first. The sudden quiet, the extra meetings, the chairs pulled closer in huddled conversations. I watched it all in real time. At 11:03, Julia reappeared, not dramatically, not like someone returning in defeat, but with quiet precision, wearing a new blazer and a smile sharp enough to slice through drywall. She went straight into a closed-door session with the VP of Legal and HR. The door didn't open for 47 minutes. When it finally did, she didn't look shaken. She looked relieved. That's when I knew something was shifting, but I couldn't tell which way. Back at my desk, a new message pinged. Hi, just letting you know our external counsel may reach out regarding your observation notes. They're conducting a parallel analysis of procedural deviation. This was real now, bigger than Lefebvre, bigger than a bad meeting. At lunch, I stepped outside. Just me, a plastic fork, and a bench that faced the glass walls of our building. And I saw Julia inside, standing with 2 junior analysts. She was smiling, nodding, animated. They were laughing. The machinery was repairing itself, right in front of me. I realized something in that moment. This wasn't about justice. It was about narrative control. Someone had filed 9.4. Someone had shaken the story. And Julia? She wasn't crumbling. She was adapting. That meant I couldn't afford to wait anymore. At 3 p.m., I opened my personal notes archive. I pulled every project I'd touched since last March. Every timeline, every version ID, every supplier feedback summary. Then I drafted a single-page document. Subject: Risk map. Documentation variances. Non-sensitive summary. I didn't accuse, I didn't imply. I just Outlined inconsistencies, patterns, dates, then I saved it. Didn't send it. Not yet. Because in companies like ours, timing is power. And the wrong truth told too early becomes a target, but told at the right moment, it becomes evidence. They thought Julia was the storm, but someone else was watching the whole system short circuit from the inside. The building had a different rhythm now, not quieter, sharper, quicker footsteps, tighter smiles. People looking over their shoulders, not to see who was coming, but to check who was watching. Every email felt like a test. Every meeting a chessboard. No one said it out loud, but everyone had started choosing a side. And I was Switzerland with a flash drive. At 9:12 a.m., the nameplate outside Julia's office was replaced with a generic label, Director. Her name wasn't removed, just covered, subtle, reversible. At 9:34, a procurement-wide email went out. New review protocols for all upcoming contracts effective immediately. Mandatory co-signature from legal and compliance before external distribution. It was signed by the COO, not Julia. That email alone unraveled weeks of back-channel power she had built. The kind of internal shortcuts senior staff use when they think no one is watching. But someone had watched. At 10:07, my calendar pinged. Not a meeting, a task. Requested, document review support, French language. Attached, a contract draft for a new European vendor. Sender, Director of Compliance. That was new. I was being looped in early, not as a translator, but as a reviewer. No badge of rank still, but someone was now acknowledging the seat I'd taken without permission 2 weeks ago. And that's what power really is in places like this. Not being given the seat, but not being asked to leave it. I said nothing. I reviewed the document. 3 pages in, I flagged a line that felt off. An ambiguous term around exclusivity phrased in translation legalese. Not technically wrong, but unclear. I wrote a note. I clicked save. And I knew someone was watching my version history this time. Not to catch me, but to protect me. But not everyone was watching in support. At 1:14 p.m., Julia appeared again. This time in the glass hallway that overlooked the operations floor. She wasn't smiling now. She stood for a moment, arms crossed, as if scanning the floor. Her eyes met mine, not by accident. She didn't look angry. She looked calm, which was worse, because that's the expression of someone who still has moves left. 15 minutes later, I was summoned by HR. Again. The same room, same polite tone. This time, the conversation was shorter. We understand you've been involved in ongoing support for compliance, Jenna from HR began. I nodded. We want to ensure you feel supported in your current role and understand the boundaries going forward. There it was, the warning gift wrapped in concern. I understand boundaries, I said. I've spent the last 2 weeks watching them get ignored. Jenna blinked. She wasn't expecting pushback. The meeting ended fast. No handshakes. Just a thin thanks and a tighter door swing behind me. Back at my desk, someone had left a post-it. No name, just 2 words. They know. That night, I checked my system access. Still active, still internal, still support. But I knew better now. Support wasn't passive. It was the only thing that holds the structure upright until it doesn't. The cracks weren't spreading from one bad decision. They were spreading from what that decision exposed. And someone was finally ready to speak. Wednesday was overcast, the kind of gray that settles into glass and makes your own reflection look like someone else. I stood at the 14th floor window longer than I meant to, watching a delivery truck try to reverse into a too small loading dock. The driver gave up, rolled forward, reversed again. I understood the feeling. Back at my desk, my screen lit up with an invite I hadn't expected. Subject: Q1 retrospective, leadership roundtable location, boardroom D attendees, legal, compliance, comms, COO, and me. No Julia. The invite wasn't about reviewing success. It was about containing damage and choosing how loud the truth would be allowed to get. I arrived 2 minutes early. They were already seated. No greetings, no water offered. Just a gesture toward the one empty chair. The COO began. We appreciate your clarity throughout the last few weeks. Translation: You've been inconvenient, but correct. The legal director continued. We want to move forward without institutional breakdown. Translation: Let's all pretend the iceberg didn't scrape the hull. Then the calm strategist leaned in. We've drafted an internal recap that frames the events as part of a broader need for structural improvement in governance. We'd like your approval on how your role is represented. I blinked. My approval? I asked. We understand that acknowledgement is important, but so is protecting team cohesion. Translation. We'll call you a key contributor as long as you don't get too specific. I didn't respond immediately, because somewhere between chapter 1 and now, I had stopped needing credit. I didn't want a spotlight. I wanted a clean system. But I also knew better. In corporate, if you don't define your story, someone else will, and they'll write you out before the last page. I'll review the draft, I said, and I'd like it in writing that no retaliatory measures will be taken against any staff who spoke up. They hesitated. Then the COO nodded once. Granted. As I stood to leave, the calm strategist added quietly, there may be a follow-up from the supplier for official record-keeping. I nodded. That was code for something bigger. Outside the boardroom, my inbox had exploded. A new internal announcement had just gone out. Subject: Q1 process audit summary and organizational update. The final paragraph read, effective immediately, we're implementing a tiered sign-off structure for all supplier contracts and reinforcing document transparency across cross-functional teams. These changes are driven by valuable input from operational team members who demonstrated exceptional integrity and attention to detail. No names, but everyone knew. 3 hours later, I received one final message, not from legal, not from HR, from Adrian, the supplier's operations manager. Subject: You said the right words at the right time. Body: We've worked with 100 companies. Only a few people ever translated more than just language. Thank you. That was it. Not a parade, not a promotion, not an apology, just a confirmation that what I did mattered. And in a system built on silence, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak anyway.